Hey everyone, it's Hans, and welcome back. After 7 glorious years with the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4, an all-new generation of consoles is dawning upon us. Over the last short while, I've been lucky enough to have a hands-on with Microsoft's Xbox Series X, arguably the most powerful console going into the new generation. With this in mind, I'm looking forward to talking to you today about this machine and how it fits into Microsoft's overall Xbox strategy and how, in many ways, it seems to be differing to what Sony is doing with the PlayStation 5, which I will have videos of in the very near future. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the Xbox Series X and why this console might be one of the best picks for the next generation. Let's do it. For those of you who do follow the channel, you'll know that I did produce an entire video unboxing the Xbox Series X. And I stand by what I said in that video. From the packaging through to opening it up and seeing the Series X for the first time, Microsoft have gone for a really wonderfully premium feel. From the design of the packaging through to the way the console is wrapped and how it is front and center of the unboxing experience, it is very clear Microsoft wants this console to be at the epicenter of your next generation gaming needs. So with this in mind, let's have a quick recap of exactly what the console looks like. From this perspective, it's a wonderful rectangular obelisk. It comes in 30 centimeters tall and about 15 centimeters by 15 centimeters in depth and width. So in this perspective, it might not fit in most traditional home entertainment centers, especially if you want to put it in the horizontal position. However, the console was obviously made to be stood vertically, and in this perspective, I can foresee it fitting in most entertainment centers. Take mine, for example. We have space on the top for where the TV sits, and then at the bottom where most of our electronics go. And in this sense, I had absolutely no issues in terms of placing the Series X. So given the dimensions, it is essentially a rectangle. And with this in mind, I personally really adore the design of the machine. It exudes a sense of wonder and interest just because of how simple it is. When you walk into a room, you don't immediately notice it because whether it's on your table or in an entertainment center, it is very unassuming. But should you approach it and look at it, it absolutely comes across as a premium device. And I really like this perspective of the Series X. I'm not somebody who enjoys RBGing all the things. So I like the fact that it has a rather unassuming but beautiful and in a sense timeless design that won't age very quickly. So how did the console perform in terms of heat and maybe noise? Well, I am very, very happy to say that the Xbox Series X is the quietest device I currently own in terms of gaming and technology. I mean, even the capture card that I use for streaming is louder than the Series X when I'm running pretty much any game. In addition to that, in terms of heat, I know there were some kerfuffles about whether or not it generates a lot of heat. Honestly speaking, I easily put my hand right over the vents at the top, and for the most part, it's really just some warm air. In fact, if you look at my entertainment center and the way that I've situated my Xbox Series X, even in that enclosed space, after hours of gaming, I've barely felt any difference. And so I'm quite confident that the machine, at least in my opinion and from my experience with it over the last couple of weeks, it's been expertly designed, and I really wouldn't worry about it from that perspective. So just a quick overview of the ports and the way the console looks. On the front of the device, there is a power button, which is made for the vertical orientation. There is a disk drive, a disk eject button, a USB-A 5 gigabit port, as well as a pairing button. And in terms of the pairing button, it also doubles as an infrared remote receiver. So if you have any of those old remotes, you can use it with the Series X. The right of the device has 4 feet on it so that you can place the device horizontally. The left of the device simply has the Xbox name, and the rear of the device is where you'll find all of the ports, namely a Kensington lock, a 1 gigabit Ethernet port, 2 USB-A 5 gigabit ports, an HDMI in, and sadly, there is no longer an HDMI out. In addition to that, there is obviously a power port, and there is also an expansion port in the back, which allows you to purchase Microsoft's expandable storage SSD, which is identical to the SSD featured inside the console. So from this perspective, it means that should you buy that SSD, the performance is going to be identical to the internal memory, which is fantastic because it means that you don't have to worry about trying to find something that will work for your system. I unfortunately don't have one just yet, but I am planning to get in the future because the usable memory on the system is only about 803 gigabytes. That might seem like a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, it kind of isn't. I managed to install about 17 titles onto my system, a mix of Xbox One, Xbox 360, and optimized for Series X games, all onto the internal SSD. And in so doing, I ended up using about 700 gigs of space, leaving about 100 left over. Now, as more games become Series X optimized, you are going to need more storage. But not just any storage, you will need Microsoft's proprietary expansion card, because optimized for Series X games can only be played off the internal SSD or that specific external memory card. Any of your other games, however, can be put on a hard drive or an external SSD and still benefit from all of the system features like faster loading times and quick resume and so on and so forth. The top of the console has a very trypophobic look to it, with a lot of pencil-thick holes, which if you look into them, you can actually see the cooling mechanism and the large rubber fan. In addition to this, it has a wonderful green layer, which depending on how you're looking at the machine, gives it a really great sense of personality. Just enough to make it unique, but not enough to take away from anything else you might have in the room. After all, it's not meant to be a showpiece. It's meant to fit into your lifestyle in the most unobtrusive way possible, and I really love it for this fact. On the bottom is a non-removable rubber base, which has the words Hello to Seattle and Xbox on it. Of course, the console is black, and in this sense it is matte black, but it has a very premium plastic. Unfortunately, it is also very much a fingerprint magnet. So if you're going to be touching this console a lot, I would recommend having a cloth nearby. I personally didn't find it too distracting, namely because of the fact that I barely touch the console, especially if you're living that digital lifestyle. I mean, you can do everything from the included Series X remote control. You will almost never need to touch the console for the most part, unless of course you're still into physical media. In terms of the included controller, it is quite obvious that the Xbox Series X controller is more a refinement than it is an innovation in any respect. In this sense, it's very much like previous Xbox One controllers, but slightly smaller and just feels so much better. I've used it for a while now, and there is a tangible difference in terms of the way the buttons feel, specifically in terms of the triggers and the bumpers. I'm of the opinion that Microsoft have obviously taken the research that they've used to develop the Xbox Elite Series 2 controller, which is the best controller in my opinion, and have taken what they've learned from it and have actually improved on the Series X controller in certain respects, namely in terms of the triggers, the bumpers, and just the general feel of the controller. With this in mind, it now has a wonderful texture on the bottom of the controller, and the same texture actually moves on to the triggers and the bumpers, so you know what buttons you're pressing when you're utilizing the controller. It also feels snappier, and I know that's a really weird thing to say, but apparently this has to do with the fact that Microsoft have invested a lot of new technologies into reducing latency. And from that perspective, although it might be subjective, it does feel good in terms of input. The Xbox Series X controller also has a dedicated capture button, which allows you to take video clips or screenshots of whatever game you're playing. In addition to that, it now works really well with the new Xbox app. And when you do take a picture and it uploads to the cloud, you immediately have access to it on your mobile device. And I've actually tested this and used it throughout the review period, and I found it to be incredibly useful and far easier than previous implementations on the Xbox ecosystem. I also really like the new octagonal D-pad on the Series X controller. Once again, very reminiscent of the Elite Series 2 default layout. Now, although you can change what the D-pad looks like on the Elite Series 2 and you can't on the Series X controller, fact is, this octagonal shape is actually my preferred means of using my Elite Series 2. So I really like the fact that this is now on the Series X controller, and it feels very good. You can actually feel each of the 8 stop points on the D-pad, and I believe that it is far more improved versus previous controllers which felt soft. This feels very clicky and very tactile. The controller also has a normal mic input as well as a really old connector for anyone who might have the old Xbox chat pad. Much like the Elite Series 2, the new Series X is also USB-C enabled, which is really great except for one thing. The console itself doesn't feature USB-C, which personally for me is a really strange omission. Now it does have 3 USB-A ports, one in the front, 2 in the back, and all of them operate at 5 gigabits per second, which is decent, but you know, it would have been nice if the ports could operate at possibly 10 gigabits a second, and if they could have added USB-C, just purely from a convenience perspective, given how a lot of headsets and now, you know, Microsoft's own controllers all use the USB-C standard. So now that we've had a good look at the console and included controller, it's time to get into what is most important about the Series X. And that is, how does the console perform? Now, I could go on about teraflops and gigahertz and gigabytes per second and so on and so forth with regards to the tech in the machine. And for the most part, those are just specs on paper. What really matters is, how does the machine perform? Does it live up to Microsoft's promises of 4K at 120 frames per second? Is it as fast as they say? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the good news is this machine performs exactly the way Microsoft have been advertising it. And in this respect, there are 2 specific pointers I do want to talk about with regards to the Series X. And those are speed, first and foremost, and secondly, the frames per second that the console allows, assuming of course you have the hardware. As is always the case with modern technology, a device is only as good as its software. Now in this sense, once again, Microsoft has taken quite a different approach to other platform holders, in the sense of the operating system found on the Series X is near identical to what is found on the Xbox One consoles. And from that perspective, it is very quick, it's fast, it's speedy. There is the addition of an all new animated background, which is exclusive to series consoles, and it provides everything that the system does. So let's take setting up the Series X for the very first time. When this happened, I was immediately greeted with a screen that asked me if I had the mobile phone and the Xbox app installed. I did. So I went through the process of simply using my mobile phone to directly connect to the Series X, and it's all software based. They literally guide you through each of the steps. And I kid you not, within 10 minutes, and that includes a title update for the operating system, I was up and running. In fact, it was less than 10 minutes. I actually timed it to, I think it was 9 minutes and 5 seconds on the dot. And that includes access to all of my games. Now you might be wondering how. How is that even possible? So in terms of the setup, part of the fast experience for me was because I have very fast fiber. So downloading that, I think it was plus minus 1 gig update, was super fast on the connection that we have. But that aside, the actual process was just very easy. I mean, there are multiple ways to do it. So although I went the mobile phone way, I could have just as easily backed up my old Xbox onto external storage. It actually does give you that option. And by plugging that into the Series X, it would have just handled everything for me. And because I already was using an external SSD on my One X, I simply needed to plug it into my Series X and I was good to go. There was literally nothing else for me to do. And from that perspective, it was just incredible, because I remember in the past years ago how it would sometimes take an hour, 2 hours to set up a new console. So to have it done so quickly on the new machine was really just fantastic. Now, still speaking on the aspect of speed, I was even more impressed when I learned that the Series X Instant On literally means instant on. When I pressed the power button in Instant On mode, the machine was often on and ready to go before my monitor or TV was finished booting up. I've never experienced that before in a console, and it honestly blew my mind. It felt very much like a mobile device, like a phone or an iPad, which is always ready to be used. And it's just a phenomenal feeling at how quick it was. Now, in terms of a cold boot, this means, you've plugged it out and there's no power coming to the console. When you turn it on from a cold boot, it only takes 20 seconds. It genuinely is that fast. And what I mean by that is, from the moment you've pressed the power button to the moment your controller becomes responsive on the screen, meaning as you can select a game to play, it only takes 20 seconds. Reboots took about 45 seconds, and I have a feeling that's because it takes about 15 to 20 seconds to shut down, and then of course there's that 20 seconds to start up again. So I'm not really sure why that takes as long as it does, but hey, even 45 seconds is not long enough to go and get a cup of coffee. And that is genuinely where the Series X's biggest advantage is for this next generation, specifically in terms of quick resume. Now, this is a basic operating system feature, meaning that it is available to all titles on the OS. And the way it works is whereby you open a game, you play it, and you decide, okay, you've had enough of this game, you're going to open another one. Now, instead of quitting out of the old game, all you do is you go into your games library and select another one. What will happen is the operating system will automatically save that game to its cache and load the new game immediately in its place. Then, let's say weeks, months, or hours, if that's your thing, when you want to go back to your previous game, you simply go back into your games and apps, select it, and within 15 seconds, you are playing a previously launched title. Now, it truly is incredible, and I managed around about, I think it was 7 to 8 major titles, meaning full Xbox One games with some Xbox Series X optimized games, before I noticed the quick resume cache replacing the oldest game in the queue. But even so, it's incredible that this is even a feature. There is currently no other device on the market that is able to do this, that is able to, within literal seconds, swap out a game you're playing and bring up a game you've previously played. 15 seconds. You've barely done it and the game is open, and it has fundamentally changed the way that I use the system. Because in my use case scenarios, what's happened is I've been playing a game like, let's say, Jurassic World Evolution or Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And then one of my friends comes online and they're like, hey, do you want to join me for a game of Apex or Call of Duty or anything like that? Now, instead of hesitating or being like, oh, why don't you just give me a couple of minutes? I just want to save quickly or whatever the case is. I don't even have to think about it. I literally just open the new multiplayer game and we play. And assuming it's not very late in the evening and we're finished playing, I can just immediately, within literal seconds, go back to my single player game that I was playing before. And it's a game changer. Honestly speaking, this is a game changer. It is incredibly fast, including being used for games that are not even optimized for the system. I mean, it really is a tangible difference. Now, where there's another benefit is if you want to copy content, whether from an external hard drive or an external SSD. And in so doing, it was really quick. I mean, here's a great example of me copying over Sea of Thieves from my external SSD to internal, and it takes not even 2 minutes at the most. It is incredibly quick, and the speed of the system above all else is really going to make the difference for users, to the point where I'm so used to the Series X that when I boot up my old One X, I'm kind of like, how did we deal with this for 7 years when this is just so remarkably different and cool? Now, the other big factor of the Series X is frames per second. Microsoft has mentioned how the Series X will go all the way from, I guess, 0 up to 120 frames per second. Now that is pretty incredible because for the most part, consoles have never really had the ability to go higher than 60 frames per second. And even in this sense, the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 seldom hit those targets in most games, especially in more newer games. Unfortunately, I don't have the hardware capabilities to capture anything in 4K above 30 frames per second, and that includes my camera that I'm recording this with, as well as my capture card that I stream with. So this video is 4K at 30, but the difference is tangible, and I advise many of you to possibly go and look at videos from Digital Foundry, for example, who have the tech and the analysis techniques to really showcase what the machine is capable of. So with this in mind, and as somebody who is more of a console gamer than I've been a PC gamer, I really haven't worried too much about frames per second. But let me tell you, after getting a review gaming laptop, which had a 144 megahertz screen. The difference is tangible between 30 frames per second, 60, and over 100. Now, I am also lucky enough to have a LG OLED C9 television. And in this sense, it is an HDMI 2.1 TV, which means I could take advantage of the Series X. And when I did so, even just the improvement from 30 frames per second to 60 felt like day and night. Everything is just smoother, more responsive. Things just feel great. Now, in my personal opinion, going above 60 is a little bit more catering towards a niche market. So with this in mind, Microsoft did give us access to several pre-release games, with Dirt 5 and Gears 5 being two of the few that are currently optimized for Xbox Series X at up to 120 frames per second. Now, I will say that playing games at 60 frames per second or higher actually makes a real-world difference, especially in terms of fluidity and the way the games feel and respond. Now, whether or not I would stick with above 60 frames per second versus graphical fidelity, I'm the kind of person who'd rather have something look prettier and possibly run at lower frames per second. But hey, at least with the Series X, you have that option. I've obviously spoken a lot about the speed of the system and the frames per second capabilities, but I'm sure you're wondering, what about the graphical fidelity? Well, the truth is a lot of next-gen only games for the Series X are just not available yet to the media for this review period. With that said, there are a variety of optimized Series X games. And in this sense, I've been able to test the system using Dirt 5, Gears 5, Forza Horizon 4, and Gears Tactics. And I have been pleasantly surprised and impressed. So it is worth mentioning that these games are cross-generational games, meaning they were first developed for Xbox One and are now being optimized for Series X, thereby including some better graphical features and so on and so forth. So it is important to remember that, because it means that these games, having been cross-generationally developed, are not going to utilize the system in its full capacity, despite being optimized for it. But even so, the games looked phenomenal. Playing Gears at 60 frames per second in true 4K in HDR was sublime. And even the 120 frames per second mode in multiplayer was something else. I've never seen a game move so quickly. The same can be said for Dirt 5, where I actually opted to play the game in 4K 60 because I prefer having those visual embellishments over a very fast frame rate. Now, of course, it's all game dependent. So for me, just these differences in the games make the machine absolutely worthwhile, despite the fact that these are all older titles, which are simply being updated to take advantage of the new machine. So I can only imagine what games specifically designed for the Series X are going to be like in the future. And I'm very, very excited for that. Now, when it comes to games, this has been a bit of a contentious point for the Xbox brand for some time. You know, a lot of people are like, oh, exclusives and so on and so forth. But the thing to remember is that Microsoft's vision for the Xbox brand is very different to a lot of other companies. For a start, they don't mind where you play, whether that's on PC, on your mobile phone with xCloud, or on an Xbox console. As such, they are geared more towards refining their ecosystem and allowing you to play where you want to play. That's not to say that exclusives aren't coming. I mean, we already know that there's Avowed from Obsidian, there's a new Fable game, there's a new Forza that is coming in the future, Halo Infinite in 2021, and so on and so forth. There is actually so much content coming to the platform in the very near future. With that aside, if you subscribe to Game Pass, you immediately have over 200 games to play. Some really big hitters and others very much indie titles. But the fact of the matter is that getting a console like this means that you have an instant game library versus a lot of other consoles whereby you might buy into them, but you are forced to buy newer games in order to play, either because they don't support backwards compatibility, looking at you, Nintendo, or they really like the remaster route, looking at you, Sony. So ultimately, what do I think of the Series X? Personally, I love it, but I am also an early adopter. Was it absolutely necessary for me to upgrade from my One X to the Series X? Yes. I say that from a speed perspective. once you've used a system like this, specifically between the Series X or the Series S, the speed improvements alone, even in non-optimized games, is incredible. I mean, we've gone from a place of possibly booting up a game and then going and making a sandwich or a mug of coffee or whatever the case is, and then coming back and further waiting through more loading screens, etc., to a point of I press A and within 15 and at the most 30 seconds, I am in the game ready to play. And that is something that once you've experienced, you will not want to come back from. And it's really incredible. In addition to that, I really do like the high frame rate potential in a lot of these games. Now, although I have a TV that supports 120 frames per second, I have a monitor that only goes up to 60. Even so, by playing on that monitor, I have noticed and felt an immediate difference. So for me, the Xbox Series X is 100% a refinement and an absolute improvement over the previous generation. Of course, your needs might be different to mine. You might not favor the need for a faster system. Perhaps for you, you're more of a, I would rather play on PC and then I'll buy a console for its exclusives. In that perspective, maybe wait for the Series X. In time, it will get better, especially with a lot of Microsoft's newer acquisitions. But for right now, if you want a system that plays Xbox games to the best of their abilities, including upgrading them automatically without any help from developers in terms of like auto HDR, better anisotropic filtering, super fast loading, the Series X is the best Xbox currently available. And I absolutely adore it. And I cannot wait to see what Microsoft and its many studios are going to do on this machine, because it is quite obvious there is a lot of untapped potential here, which is not being showcased in current generational games, whereby games are developed for the older gen and are moving into the next gen. And I do think for both the series consoles as well as the upcoming PlayStation 5, we will only really see these machines shine within the next 2 years. And I am really glad to be here for the ride. If you like this review, you know what to do, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Ciao for now.